Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inside True Crime, your exclusive backstage pass to the show. Today, I'm sitting down with the host of the show, Celisia Stanton, and we're going to dive deeper into what it's really like to work behind the mic on such a complex project. To start us off, Celisia, can you tell us all a little bit more about yourself and what brought you into podcasting in the first place?
Yeah. Well, actually, you know what? I have to kick my cat out because he's going to be a nuisance. Like, if you're going to sit here, then okay. But if you're not, you got to go. You gotta go. Okay.
I think that's very relatable.
You know, it's like, and I was like, you know what? This might start picking up some of his purring. But yeah, he has to leave. Okay. Yeah. So for me, I ended up in podcasting in a super non-traditional way. I didn't have any kind of media background or anything like that. It wasn't working in journalism even. I have been a wedding and portrait photographer. It's what I did since basically I started doing photography like at the end of my college career and kind of just went into having my own business and was doing that full time within a year of graduating. And so moving into 2020 with the pandemic, being a wedding photographer obviously was not a great time for anybody, but certainly there weren't a lot of events going on. And so I found myself kind of with a lot more free time on my hands. I am from Minneapolis, Minnesota, which, you know, I love the Twin Cities, big fan. And so obviously, as everyone knows, in 2020 in June May, George Floyd was killed. And then subsequently, there was this huge global racial reckoning that happened that summer. Really kind of with Minneapolis being kind of ground zero or the origin point of all of that. And that was something I was really involved in because, these were issues I had always really cared about, especially, as a Black woman myself, living in the Midwest. I have gay parents. Like all of these issues were things that I grew up thinking and talking a lot about. I also did debate in high school, coached debate for over a decade. And so I've always really loved engaging with things in a really critical way. And so I started actually posting a lot of sort of racial and social justice educational stuff on Instagram after George Floyd was killed. And I found a lot of those posts really resonated with people. I had a number of posts that went viral and I grew this kind of big platform on Instagram. And that was kind of the first experience I'd had in my adulthood of realizing like, hey, actually, maybe people are kind of interested in my perspective or my point of view. I always knew that I wanted to do something a little bit more long form. And because, social media can be very black and white, like full of hot takes, right? And for me, as somebody who always has kind of liked those like deeper, more critical discussions, examinations of things, that was not going to be a great place. And I just don't feel like I'm like fit for like the influencer life. I always felt like I didn't want to do the influencer thing. I really wanted to really help spark interesting conversations and thoughts for people. And so I didn't know what that was going to be. But then, simultaneous to that, in late summer of 2020, I started working with this financial advisor, which, a lot of my listeners probably kind of know this story, but I was defrauded. And actually, this financial advisor stole my entire life savings. He actually was stealing from all of his investor clients. He stole over $2 million. And he was under investigation by the FBI and eventually turned himself in. It was a whole thing. There's a whole criminal legal process involved in that. And he was eventually, he pled guilty and was sent to prison. And that's where he is right now, serving out that sentence. But for me, in the aftermath of that experience, it was really, obviously really deeply sad, hard to kind of cope with that and figure out like what my next steps were going to be. And I literally spent all day, every day, just doing cat puzzles, listening to true crime podcasts, kind of vegging out. December in Minnesota, so it's like gross. And it's 2020, so it's like double gross, And so in binging all this true crime, I just found myself constantly always pausing it and complaining to my husband about things that I felt like were missing from these stories. And a lot of that came from the fact that I just felt like, somebody with my perspective, like there weren't a lot of people, I should say, with my perspective that were making true crime media. And so I didn't feel like the questions that I had from my vantage point were often being answered. And so I basically did enough of that pausing and talking to my husband that he was like, why don't you just start your own podcast? So I was like, okay, that's a great idea. And so that's what I did. And I ended up creating True Crime, which debuted that next spring, in spring of 2021. I just went for it. I didn't know what it was going to look like, how to make a podcast. I kind of just figured it out as I went, recorded in my closet, and, put it out there to see if it would resonate with people. And then was lucky to enough that, I feel like it developed a very loyal audience of people who also felt like this perspective was missing from the genre. And then, was lucky enough to connect with Tenderfoot TV and bring true crime to the network to be a part of their slate of shows. And so that's what I've been doing. And I also had the opportunity to host The Vanishing Point as well, another Tenderfoot TV show. And that was a really cool experience, too, to get to do something pretty different in the true crime genre than what true crime is. So, yeah, that's how I ended up here.
I love it. Thank you for sharing all of that. One of the things that really stands out to me about true crime and about the way that you share these stories is that I immediately noticed this very in-depth, very compassionate, very holistic view of what's going on with these cases. So it's very cool to hear you talk about that being a big part of your origin story, is just bringing this unique perspective, because it really stands apart to me as exactly what you're describing.
Thank you.
Where did the name come from, and what does the title mean to you?
Yeah, so for me, true crime, I think it might have even been the first idea that had occurred to me. I don't know, it just kind of popped into my head, but it was among a list of other ideas. And I actually was kind of looking back through a text I'd sent one of the co-producers on the show, Olivia, kind of when I had just come up with this idea. I texted her about it, and I was texting her some of the names I was thinking about, and some of the names it was funny to look back on. I also was considering Horizon Line or Reconditioned, Rotten. I don't really know what the thought was behind all of these, but true crime was kind of in the forefront of my mind, and I remember I had pitched them to my husband to see kind of what his thought was, and he didn't skip a beat. He was like, it's true crime, that's what it is, and for me, I felt like it really reflected what the show is supposed to represent. Obviously, it's in the true crime genre, but it is what I think crime really looks like in our society, and things that I feel like aren't necessarily a perspective that isn't told in true crime media. But if you look at the cover art for true crime, it's literally my eye, right? It's my eye, my face, right? Actually, a little fun Easter egg is if you look really close, you can see my husband Andrew. He's in my pupil.
Is he the one that took the photo?
Yeah, that's for the real fans who want to look for that. But actually, I feel like it really represents what I was thinking about the name, and what I was thinking about the show in general is that the show is perspective driven. It's how I see the world. It's how I see these cases. It's what feels truer to me as someone who didn't feel represented by kind of the existing true crime storytellers that were already out there. And I don't really ever want to create confusion, especially with the name. I think maybe some people see the title and they're like, true crime. Okay, she's a just the facts girl. But then you might come and listen, and then you're like, oh my God, this girl's not objective at all. She has all these opinions. She's biased, and she thinks she's not biased. But that's the thing. I feel like I know I'm biased. Everyone is biased. I don't think that's a dirty word. This might be a hot take, but real objectivity doesn't exist. I don't think it does. True crime is a show that's really, I think it is a nuanced show. It's a show that cares about the facts, of course. But it's a show about the human experience, and it's grounded in my human experience. And I always kind of wanted to be honest about that. And I think, for listeners, that doesn't mean that people have to agree with me. And in many ways, quite the contrary. I hope that my perspective challenges people, and that it allows them to think more deeply about their own perspective, that raises questions that, they wouldn't normally be raised for them, to help them discover what truer is for them, right? So that's kind of what the thought is behind the name. And I'm really excited. I'm glad I didn't pick any of those other ones. I feel like it really communicates what I was hoping it would.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like there is this kind of wraparound perspective that you bring to the stories that you're, looking into, researching, and sharing. And you are very clear about, when I was learning about this, I felt this, or I perceived this as that, and I wanted to know more about this. And to me, it doesn't come off as, yes, we all have our biases, but it doesn't come off as you having a biased agenda you're trying to push forward. but it comes off as you really wanting to uncover what's might not have been uncovered previously. And there's this like element of curiosity that as a listener, it's very contagious. I then get really, really curious as I hear you dig deeper into these stories. Can you talk a little bit about how you craft those narratives and check your potential blind spots as you're digging in to cover the bases in these really complex cases that you've worked on?
Yeah, I think a lot of, and I appreciate all the sort of like what you're saying about the curiosity being contagious and that being kind of part of what the experiences of listening to the show, because that's really what my goal is. And I think for me, my sort of debate background helps a lot with that. I'm trained to look for holes in things, to have a response to the response to the response to the response, right? That one of the things we always say in debate is every argument has a response, right? Like, don't worry, you can come up with something to say to everything. So I think that sort of way of looking at the world, you automatically become sort of your own sort of devil's advocate, and then the person who's responding to the devil's advocate and all of that. So I think that helps in trying to figure out what questions to ask and what sort of like research rabbit holes to go down and what to present that might feel new or interesting or different to the listener. Obviously, like I said, I'm not aiming to be a just the facts girl. I'm aiming to be somebody who has a perspective that comes with my own lived experiences. But I really I'm trying to bring the listener on with me on the journey that I'm on when I'm looking at a case, right? I think, true crime, it's not an investigative show in that we're, at least, to this point, it's not like we're taking an unsolved case and we're going to go and we're going to like hunt down the people involved and interview them and see if we could find who really was responsible or uncover new evidence. That's not really what the show is about. It's about, taking existing information that's out there and like synthesizing it in a new and interesting way that highlights, important issues in our society. But I still wanted True Crime to have a little bit of that feeling of like, I think one of the great things about investigative podcasts is how the listener feels like they're with you on that journey, right? They're it's so great to be like in the car with the investigator, and you're like, you hear the crunching of the leaves outside as they're walking up to knock on somebody's door, right? So for me, I'm usually sitting behind my computer. It's not quite the same thing, but I can bring them with me on the journey that I'm taking mentally, like saying out loud the questions that I had as I was going through this process and sort of like posing that or saying that's how that led me to this piece of information. But ultimately, I think that I want True Crime to be the kind of show that asks more questions than it answers. Like if you, every episode, like almost every episode right before the theme song and we get into the actual episode itself, I'm asking some kind of question or a series of questions that I wanted to look into. And I'm like, this is what I wanted to find out. And then, we get into it. And that's because, True Crime is supposed to be a show that creates curiosity for folks. So really, it's not supposed to be a resource necessarily, because like I said, most of this information is accessible if you want to go and find it. It's supposed to be a starting point for the listener's own action. And that's why too, like we end episodes with action items and stuff, because it's like, okay, true crime is an entertainment medium. That's okay. That's not like a dirty word. I think that anything that you want to inspire people to take action should be entertaining, right? This is just the human psychology. Like we need to be interested in things to care about them. But yeah, if we can tell really interesting stories that compel people to go out into their real life, ask critical questions, have important conversations, volunteer, donate, whatever it might be, then I think that's great. So anyway, I don't know that that's a perfect answer to your question, but it's kind of how I'm thinking about crafting some of the narrative and some of the goals I have.
Yeah. I mean, that is a perfect question. Absolutely. For the listeners, she's not paying me to say all these things. I'm genuinely a really big fan of the show. But I agree with you. I think that's something I love the resources that you have at the end of every show and the fact that you bring in action items for people if they want to take them, because that is something that I've often find can get a little tricky in the world of true crime, is like, where's that line of voyeurism and kind of exploitation of people's experiences and traumas for the sake of entertainment, right? And I think that something you do really well is, again, that holistic human viewpoint, as well as then, okay, if you want to take the next step, if you want to actually, participate, here are many ways that you can. And it just encourages this kind of civil engagement that's really, really important. And I think a lot of us are looking for as true crime listeners, and it's not always there. So it's very cool to hear that that's a strong intention that you have in crafting the show. So as you're researching each episode, how long does it take you? Do you have any help? Are you fully solo? Can you talk us through that process a little bit of just choosing a case and then digging into the research?
Yeah. So for me, season 1 was researched and written basically entirely by me, just on my own. I had help from, actually one of the current co-producers, Olivia, was also working on season 1, and she was really helpful, especially in terms of like really marketing the show and the branding of the show and all of that. But in terms of the actual like production creation of the show, that's kind of just something I was figuring out on my own. And especially, I was glad I did that too, because, I wanted to develop the show's identity and really sort of be able to do that myself before, trying to like hopefully have people come in and help with that production process. But what's been great, obviously, about, partnering with Tenderfoot TV is like the ability to bring in some more resources to kind of help pull the show together. And so now that same co-producer, Olivia, she supports on both research and writing. So what we do is we try to condense the research for each case to like a week and then a week to write. And so typically, or this is how we did it for season 2, it was like 2-week period. This is the case we're focused on. Condensing all of the research into a week and especially condensing the writing into a week is difficult. I spent far longer on both in the season 1. And I think, especially the writing is tough because it's creative nonfiction. So like, it's not just like, okay, whatever, a stream of consciousness here. It's like, I want it to sound pretty, beautiful, right? That's kind of like, I think part of, the appeal of the show and the storytelling of the show. But it's definitely hard to do. I don't know if you've ever heard I don't know if you've ever heard of the phrase like writing is thinking, but like I feel like that's so true in that, you can't do anything else while you're writing. Like this is not something you can be listening to stuff. I can barely, sometimes I'll listen to music, but it is very intense, brain power that's required to craft, all these highly researched sentences. And for me, with it being, there's nothing mindless about it. And it's very difficult to basically have to write a 20-page, highly researched creative nonfiction piece, every other week. And so that's a challenge. I feel like, and this is like something that writers say all the time, but I love having written. Like the process of writing itself, though, is kind of brutal. Research is a little bit better. You can be guided by your curiosity, let me say. And so that can be fun. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge, but it is really great to have help and support on the second season. And, I think ultimately it's really cool now to be at this point where we were able to put out these episodes and it makes all of that, background work totally worth it. But I think, with it being an episodic show where every episode is a different case, it's sort of like you're just creating a new little like documentary every time. And I think that's the power of episodic storytelling that's so cool, is that you get to hear about so many different topics and themes and issues. But it also becomes a challenge because it's a completely new, you got to like reset the slate every single time. So I always joke to my husband that I'm like, once I'm done writing each season, it's like I've basically written a book, like that's the amount of writing that goes into it. So yeah, it's a muscle that I've had to develop over time. And especially like just being like, it doesn't feel like you want to write today and you're just going to do it anyway. You can't wait till inspiration strikes. Otherwise, you're never going to have a finished episode. So, but yeah, it's great to have support for sure.
How do you select the cases that you're going to work on?
All of the cases have kind of come in a different way. We do take suggestions. And sometimes people will like DM me, or, sometimes I will be researching about a particular topic that I'm like interested in and happen upon a case that way. Or sometimes it'll be like a friend that'll kind of like text me an article and then it'll lead me down a certain path. So it's all very different. But I think for me, in terms of like picking those ones and being like, this is the one that I'm going to do for true crime, I really like to cover all different kinds of things. I think from the very beginning, it was always really important to me that True Crime be seen as a true crime podcast, not as a social justice podcast, not as a history podcast, not as that true crime podcast with that Black host. Like, no, like a true crime podcast. I want it to be genre shifting. That was really always my goal. And so, and I wanted to be in the episodic space specifically because I felt like that was a place where there was a lot of room for the kind of storytelling I wanted to do. You have limited series, which is one case covered over, maybe 8, 10, 12 episodes. And then you have episodic, every episode, different case. And I felt like, with a limited series, it's inherently a little bit more nuanced, right? Because you're diving into one case over 10 hours. I mean, like, I was thinking about this the other day. It's like, you don't even get 10 hours for a Netflix documentary. So, like, there is nothing more in depth than like a true crime 10-part series on a case, right? But episodic, it's like, 40 minutes. It's just there's so much space, especially if you're not doing investigative work, to just kind of maybe just sort of be regurgitating like from one source, like a Wikipedia or something like that. And so I felt like there was just a lot of need in this part of the like media landscape for true crime stories that went deeper. And so that meant that if I was going to be an episodic true crime show, I wanted to cover all those different types of stories, stories that are covered on other shows, and then stories that maybe other shows wouldn't consider covering. So there are kind of a few main categories I think of that most true crime cases fit into. One would be like infamous cases, right? And this is really where I kind of started too. The very first episode I wrote for the show was about Darlie Routier, who is this woman who was convicted of killing 2 of her children in Texas and is in prison and on death row for that. And this is a case that's pretty, it's not as infamous as maybe like, the Manson case, which is another case we covered in season 2, but in true crime circles, pretty well known. And so I thought, let me start here with this case because it's one that sort of interests me. And if I can figure out a way to tell it in a unique, compelling way, then maybe I actually have something unique to share with this show. And so kind of diving into that story, it wasn't long before I figured out like, oh, wow, there's a lot of things here that I haven't heard covered in any of the other coverings I'd come across to that point, and questions and a perspective I had that did feel unique. And so I kind of like to apply that to lots of different infamous cases. Like I mentioned, the Manson 2-part series, or, we did Jonestown in season 1, a case where, a lot of people feel like, they know things about it. I remember I polled my Instagram audience when we put out that episode, like, how well do you know this case? How well do you know Jonestown? A lot of people were like, oh, no, super well. And then, like, what was kind of funny is I had so many people reaching out to me after they listened to the episode being like, oh my God, I thought I knew, but like I had no idea that the majority of the people who died in Guyana were Black folks, Black women in particular, that Jim Jones was this really like this figure who represented these issues of racial injustice, of class injustices, right? That he was really attracting people into People's Temple, the cult that was behind Jonestown, with this progressive messaging. Like you listen to some of Jim Jones's like clips, and I'm like, sort of sounds like Bernie Sanders, like in some of the ways that he's talking about things, And so I feel like with a lot of infamous cases, there's ways to look at it that are unique. And then also another category that I think is kind of unique to true crime is covering cases that are maybe typically relegated to like history shows. And, we did that in season 1 by covering the Tulsa Race Massacre. Season 2, one of our first episodes we put out was on the assassination of MLK and the untold story of that. These are stories that have historical significance, but they can be told with the true crime treatment, right? They can be seen through that lens because they are true crime stories. And I think that telling those sorts of stories through a true crime perspective is so important because it's like, the true crime girlies aren't listening to the history podcast, right? Like they are consuming the true crime stuff. And so if you can put it in a format that is accessible and interesting to them and entertaining to them, then you're going to like increase people's access to this really important information. So like with MLK, it's like, people barely know like any facts about like the official narrative of his assassination. I didn't really know pretty much anything. It was like, oh yeah, like didn't he get shot out on a balcony, some assassin, right? And it's true. Like he was shot at the Lorraine Motel by a single bullet from an assassin. Yeah. The man who took the fall for it was James Earl Ray. He pled guilty. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison. But the King family has never believed that official narrative. And in 1999, they did a civil trial taking the U.S. government or entities of the U.S. government, basically suing entities of the U.S. government alongside a bunch of other people and saying, they were involved in a conspiracy to kill King. And they won that civil trial. That was in 1999. That's crazy that, like, none of us really know that much. Some people do, but, like, I had no idea. And a lot of my friends and peers had no idea that happened. So I think covering those cases feels important to me too. And then, of course, typical true crime stories that you're going to hear on other shows that are kind of more traditional and sort of their arc, And then also I like to sort of examine stories that I think play with questions of victim and perpetrator. I think a lot of true crime kind of like has this, or puts out this idea that like crime is this like really neat narrative of like there's an innocent, beautiful victim with this amazing personality, and then there's this evil perpetrator who needs to be brought to justice. And I feel like in the real world, things are often a lot more complicated than that. In one of the episodes we covered about Alice Sebold, the author of the very famous book, eventually adapted to a movie, The Lovely Bones, who, she had written another book called Lucky, which was a memoir about her own experience of a violent sexual assault that happened when she was in college. And it tells a story of the trial and conviction of the person who assaulted her. And the man who was convicted in that trial was Anthony Broadwater. Turns out, though, and we just found this out a few years ago, Anthony Broadwater didn't actually attack Alice Sebold. Alice Sebold was attacked, but she had misidentified him. And that's a super common phenomenon, especially cross-racially. Cross-racial misidentification is very prevalent. And so, that's a story where it's like, wow, this man spent 16 and a half years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. So many elements of his life, even once he was out of prison, were dictated by that original event. Right. Alice Sebold built a whole career on, kind of speaking out about these issues at a time when, pre-Me Too movement, when it was not seen as okay to be vocal about it. She went on Oprah and talked about it. She wrote op-eds. She was really inspirational to a lot of women. And so who's the victim? Who's the perpetrator? It's really unclear, right? It's messy. And I think that those are also stories that I'm attracted to for the show, because I think that they're a little bit more realistic about, what crime looks like in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just talking about that case last night.
Yeah, it's wild.
It's really wild. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, go give it a listen. It's phenomenal. I cried a lot. But that's who I am. So you're already actually touching on this quite a bit, but what has been maybe one of your favorite or most impactful cases to research so far working on the show?
Yeah, I mean, I can't pick a single episode just because they're all important, right? And I feel like they've affected me in different ways. But I think one that's always stood out to me was the case of Mindy Dodd, which we covered kind of in between season 1 and season 2. But if you're looking for it, you can just look at season 1 and it's one of the last episodes. It's there. And the reason that episode was really cool for me is because I actually got to like connect with Mindy and meet with her and talk with her, and actually end up meeting her in person too. And her story is, I actually came across it because my husband had sent me an article or tweet about an article actually, where this author the premise was essentially about the TV show Snapped, which, most people probably know, really famous TV show, still running, super long running true crime show about like women who basically go crazy and like commit murder and stuff. And it was just kind of about the women of Snapped, some of the women of Snapped, and maybe she didn't just snap. Like, what if there was more to some of these stories? And so that's kind of how I got introduced to Mindy's case, because Mindy was on an episode of Snapped. She was in prison at the time I had heard about this. And she was in prison for like basically being a part of a plot to kill her husband. And I was curious what would happen if I reached out to her hear her side of the story. And as it turned out, yeah, like, you know, she was convicted of this crime, but, you know, and I think it's worth noting too that she still says that, you know, she's innocent, that she had nothing to do with this plot to kill her husband. Her husband was killed by their nephew, but he said that basically Mindy had kind of forced him to do it and knew that he would be doing that. And Mindy, you know, what's wild about it is Mindy's husband was actually first her stepfather and was married to her mother and had repeatedly sexually assaulted her all throughout her childhood until she got pregnant as a teenager with his child. And then he left her mom to marry her. And they started this life together, I guess, and, you know, had a few kids together. And that's already such an exploitative dynamic, right? We know that he must be an abusive person. Like, that's just sort of inherent to the idea that he, you know, this was his stepdaughter originally. The power dynamics there don't make sense. And, you know, according to a lot of people who knew him, he continued to be super abusive to Mindy alongside a lot of other people. And, you know, maybe his own kids would be next. That was a question that worried Mindy. And so I think that her story was much more complex than just a simple narrative about a woman who had snapped. So it was really cool, I think, to get to connect with her. Like I said, she was in prison at the time I had first reached out. I reached out through like an email that she got to like her prison email account. And then she actually was granted clemency by the governor. And she was released, like just literally, I don't know, weeks after I'd first contacted her, which was kind of really wild, serendipitous almost. And so we did a few interviews, and then I actually got to go and meet with her and kind of get more details on, you know, who she is and how is her life after prison. And I think, you know, for a lot of people, prison's this black hole. Like, you know, the story ends at conviction. And I think with true crime, I always want to examine stories that go where other stories stop, right? Where other stories don't explore. And I think, you know, Mindy, just like other folks I've spoken to who are incarcerated currently or formerly, is much more interesting and funny and just human than I think a lot of people consider when they think about people in prison, right? It feels like, oh, well, you know, you went to prison, you did something bad, especially if you're there for something like murder, and, you know, who cares? But these are real people. And I think that, you know, actually getting to connect with her really highlighted that as well. So yeah, that's always going to be one that sticks out to me.
Have you had any specific challenges that you faced while working on this show that you'd like to talk about?
I think that, you know, because true crime isn't an investigative podcast, my like actual production process, research process, writing process is relatively smooth. Mm-hmm. I think, you know, the biggest thing is really just that it is time consuming to make these episodes. And especially, you know, I think in an ideal world, true crime is a weekly show and we, you know, we're more always on or something like that. But I think it's hard because you're always balancing like the need for a lot of nuance alongside the need to, like, you know, move to the next story and the next issue and the next cause. So that's something I'm always trying to balance, is like that efficiency alongside, you know, the show staying what it's meant to be, what it was created to do. But yeah, we're kind of, I think, just getting better and better at that the more episodes we make.
So as you're in the process of producing a show and you're researching for a week, writing for a week, how do you balance and protect your own like mental and emotional health as you're digging in?
Yeah, for me, I mean, like, you know, in general, I think that too much news consumption, too much consumption of tragedy, traumas that you can't, especially ones you can't do anything about, can be you know, difficult for anybody's mental health, right? You have to have appropriate boundaries. But I think for me, you know, the biggest thing is in general how I like approach any of these issues is if you can do your own thing, if you can focus on something and kind of stay in your lane, it helps to kind of maintain that stamina. So a lot of times, like, true crime for me is that way, that I'm kind of like working on trying to change the world or to, you know, leave a meaningful impact or to address the causes that I care about, you know, to tell these stories and these, you know, with all their complexity and nuance and to get people to think and get people to take action. That's how I am a part of, you know, the movements that I want to contribute to. And so for me, like, it's almost like the opposite. It's not like, oh, I need to like have tools to maintain my mental health so I can continue doing this. It's like, this is my way of being able to keep all the other things in my life in check, right? It's like, because I'm doing this and I'm focused on that. You know, like my husband's a teacher. And so for him, it's like, it doesn't matter what's happening in the world, who's elected president, what policies are going on, you know, what you saw, like the tragedy that might have, happened in your community or across the country, like all those things matter, but it doesn't change the work that he is doing. He shows up every day to his students to help them learn how to read and, get better at math. And all of those things are important. And all of those things help to create the world that he wants to see. So that's how I feel about true crime as well. And I think, also the other thing is, especially with true crime storytelling, it's really important to stay tapped into this place of empathy, right? To be able to tell these stories in the right way. I think for me, I'm somebody who's like decently good at compartmentalizing. I think that there's probably people, I have people in my own life who are like, oh, I have to kind of mentally prepare before I listen to your show, right? But for me, I'm able to kind of keep it in its space, but also I need to be kind of tapped into my feelings and empathy and emotions, because then otherwise, how am I going to help the listener feel those emotions? For me, it's like, I want, when someone's listening to an episode of True Crime, that they are feeling the feelings, right? Like, even when you were saying earlier, like, oh yeah, you listened to the Alice Sebold episode and that's like, you're crying, it's like, that's kind of the goal here. Like, that's my goal here as a storyteller, right? Is to get the listener tapped into that emotional spot too. That like everything I'm doing in the creative process is to elicit that response, because when we have an emotional response to a story, that's what inspires us to act. That's what inspires us to feel passionate about doing something and changing something. So it's almost like, I know your question was like, well, how do you protect your mental emotional health? And I'm kind of saying like, don't. But I think the way you do it is by understanding that you're one person, what's the thing that you're going to do in your life, or what's the small actions that you can take to contribute, and don't let it completely overwhelm you, and go from there.
What has been something that you've learned while you've been working on this show?
Yeah, I think for me, it's obviously a million things, and it depends on the story and the case. But one of the things I think, when I think about, kind of the impact of the entire show, is just the power of a single story, right? And I think also this is actually kind of exactly what we were just talking about, right? About how it drives us to, a single story can drive us to take action. I always think about, right, in fact, right, part of my impetus for starting this show was the murder of George Floyd, not super directly, right? But in that catalyzed me to start sharing some of my perspective. Right. And that's how I found out it resonated with people. And so take the murder of George Floyd, right? This catalyzed this giant global movement, right? His murder, his one story. It's not as if police brutality is something that's just brand new phenomenon. It's not as if we didn't have lots of statistics, that activists and researchers and academics have been telling us about for years and years, right? But there's something about that one video of George Floyd that really awoke something in people, right? And that of course comes on the work in the backs of all of the work of activists and organizers who had been doing things for many years. But that singular story was something that people could watch and they could map onto, right? It's so much easier to connect to something when we can see an individual person. Statistics don't make us feel things, people do, right? So with truer crime, that's another great thing about it being episodic, and just kind of what I've learned throughout the process is these stories, individual stories, do have the power to move people. And that's why we should keep telling true crime stories. I think sometimes, there's this feeling of from some people, and of course, probably not the people who are listening to this, but this sort of feeling in popular discourse of well, maybe true crime in general is just always exploitative, and there's no place for it, and we shouldn't consume true crime media at all. And I always felt well, okay, but what if the answer isn't to not consume them, but to go deeper? And so I think that the potential power of all of these individual stories is so great. And I think that is something that can be applied way beyond true crime, but just in general, when we think about, going out in the world and doing things and trying to promote the causes we care about, is to consider how people think about things and consider how powerful an individual experience can be for somebody and how motivating that can be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's what you're saying around kind of resensitizing people,
Yeah,
like you're
exactly.
really bringing the human element of it. And I think that is part of what that, summer of 2020, like the video of George Floyd elicited in people, as it was so clear, hit straight to the emotional core of so many people and created a response that was really big, and I think it's really important to maintain humanity.
Yeah, definitely.
Like you're saying. So when you're crafting the show, and let me know if this has changed over time, but are there certain people that you've been trying to reach and a, type of listener that you've been wanting to consume truer crime?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like to the point I made earlier about like wanting to be a true crime show, it's like for me, I think the show is for anyone who likes listening to true crime. Like any true crime listener, I want to be a true crime listener. And I think that because we cover so many different types of cases, there is something for everybody. Some people are going to love all the episodes. Some of them are going to really resonate with particular types of stories. But yeah, like when I was saying earlier that I wanted to be genre shifting, like I really mean that. So everybody who listens to true crime, I want to listen to true crime. But also, and not to be greedy about the listeners, but I'm like, also anyone who thinks that they don't like true crime, I think is a perfect person to listen to true crime, because I want to change their mind about the power of the genre and about how these stories can be told. And I think that's one thing that we've heard from certain listeners is they'll say things like, oh, like either I used to listen to true crime, but then I couldn't listen to it anymore because of whatever qualms that they had with the genre. And then some people who are just like, yeah, I've never liked true crime because I just feel like, it's exploitative or whatever else. But I found something different in truer crime. And I want that. Like I want this to be a show for anybody. And I think that there are stories that can connect with anybody.
What can listeners expect from the future of the show?
Well, I definitely want to tell more stories for true crime for the podcast to hopefully do a season 3. And I would love to explore like a single case more deeply, maybe over like a limited series. I always have a running list of case ideas. There's one case that I've been working on for a while that like I'm hoping to do something with that, about a man named Keith Lamar, who is currently on death row in Ohio. And his story is very interesting. He was actually incarcerated when he was young for murder. And this was a murder. He pled guilty. He was a drug dealer. He had kind of grown up in poverty, had experienced a lot of like really traumatic things. And that had kind of led him to this place where, yeah, he was high rolling, dealing drugs, living a very fast life. And one day he was, a group of men went to rob him. And there was a shootout. And one of the people who had come to rob him was killed in that shootout. And so Keith went to prison for his murder. So that's already a little bit complicated, I think, right? But he pled guilty. And but while he was in prison, there was a prison riot. The longest, it's actually tied for the longest prison riot in American history in terms of the number of days. And, a guard was killed, as were several prisoners. And after that, there was a lot of outrage from the community, a strong want and need to hold some people accountable for that prison riot. And Keith was one of the people who was ultimately charged with the deaths of several of the prisoners who were killed during the riot. And he was convicted and sent to death row for that. So he went from being just like a prisoner that was going to get out eventually to a prisoner who now has a death sentence. And he has insisted on his innocence since this happened in the 90s. And I got a chance to really connect with Keith, and I've spoken to him on several occasions. He's a really, really interesting person. He's doing an insane amount on death row. I mean, I think people would just be shocked to hear what he's been able to do from death row in terms of like activism work and starting a nonprofit and creating a music album and all of that. I mean, people can kind of look into it if they want, or hopefully wait till, we're able to put something out. But I think there's just a lot here to explore. A very interesting story. I don't really know of many other podcasts about like a prison riot. I think that's already kind of like something that would be interesting to explore. But then I just think Keith is so interesting, and his stakes are very, very high, right? He's saying he's innocent. He wants to retell his story in the court of public opinion, as he says it. So I think I would love to help be a part of getting his story out there.
Wow. I can't wait to hear it.
Yeah.
It sounds really interesting. Have you interviewed other incarcerated people in the process of the show? Or is that a totally new kind of threshold for you?
It's not super new. No. I mean, because Mindy was incarcerated. And then we did an episode in season 1 about Celisia Stanton, who was another sort of like wrongful conviction case. And I spoke with his mom, and she was a big part of producing that episode because he was convicted as a teenager. And she was a huge advocate for him at the time, and then also like in his release and eventual exoneration. And then in general, we did an episode this season on DeForest Johnson, another man on death row in Alabama. I didn't get to speak with him because actually they don't allow death row inmates in Alabama to speak with any media. But, was able to work and connect with Beth Shelburne, who's a journalist who's been investigating this case for years. So I think in general, like this idea of kind of telling the stories of people who are incarcerated formerly or currently is not new for the show. But yeah, I definitely want to continue kind of down that path and, talking to all different types of people. And I think that's one of the great things about having a little bit more resources is being able to sort of make those connections and reach outs and do more interviews and integrate some of that stuff as well.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with everyone?
Yeah, just that, I obviously, if you're listening to this, you're a Tenderfoot Plus subscriber, which is so great. It's such a great support to the work that we're doing here on True Crime and all of the shows that Tenderfoot puts out. And I think, if you haven't already left a rating and review, please do so. I always say, everyone's super disappointed when they have a Netflix show that they love and they're so into it, and then there's no second season. And it's you have the same thing is true for podcasts, right? But you have a direct impact on whether or not we get to tell more of these stories and make more episodes. And I think, sharing the show, leaving a rating and review, sharing about it on your social media, but also texting it to friends and family and all of that, it really, really helps. It makes a huge difference. So I would just encourage anyone who hasn't done that yet to get on it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Celisia. It's a joy to hear you share so much about the show and your intentions behind it and all of the awesome work that you're doing. I'm a fan. I know everyone listening is a fan. And if people want to get in touch, say they have a case that they really want you to check out, where do you recommend they send those?
Yeah, so if you go to the website, truecrimepodcast.com, we have all our show notes on there, but there's also a page where you're able to do a message directly or give a case suggestion. So definitely always looking for more of those. Definitely reach out.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thanks, Celisia.
Yeah, thank you.